The monsoon rains hammered the corrugated tin roof of the Ramgarh training camp with a relentless percussion that matched the rhythm of rifle fire echoing across the Bihar Province ranges. Lieutenant General Joseph Warren Stilwell stood in the doorway of the armory, watching as Chinese soldiers of the new 38th Division struggled with weapons that seemed designed for giants. The American Enfield M1917 rifles, each weighing over 9 pounds and stretching 46 inches from buttstock to muzzle, dwarfed the compact frames of men who had marched out of China carrying little more than determination and the bitter memory of Japanese steel. "These rifles are too damn big," muttered Captain Chen Wei-ming of the 112th Regiment, his weathered hands gripping an M1917 that had been manufactured 3 years before he was born. The weapon bore the eagle-stamped markings of the Eddystone Arsenal in Pennsylvania, one of 1,181,908 rifles that had rolled off the Baldwin Locomotive Works production line during the desperate months of 1918. 25 years later, in the sweltering heat of eastern India, these forgotten veterans of the Western Front were about to write a new chapter in the annals of warfare. Stilwell watched as American advisors demonstrated the M1917's manual of arms to soldiers who had never seen a bolt-action rifle with such precision engineering. The weapon's distinctive dog-leg bolt handle, designed by British engineers at the Royal Small Arms Factory in Enfield Lock, placed the bolt knob perfectly positioned for rapid cycling. The protected aperture sights, nicknamed ears by American doughboys, offered faster target acquisition than anything the Japanese Imperial Army carried in their advance through Southeast Asia. But first, the Chinese would need to master weapons built for men who stood 6 inches taller and weighed 50 pounds more. The solution arrived on a humid morning in September 1943, when Ishapur Arsenal technicians began the delicate work of modifying America's most numerous Great War rifle for Asian hands. Using precision tools and careful measurements, they shortened both barrel and stock, reducing the overall length from 46 inches to 41 inches. The modifications preserved the weapon's essential ballistic performance while creating a rifle that Chinese soldiers could actually wield effectively in jungle combat. Each shortened rifle received new proof marks indicating the modification work had been completed at the British Arsenal in India, creating a unique variant that would soon bloody the nose of Japan's most elite infantry division. General Sun Li-jen of the Chinese New 38th Division examined one of the modified rifles with the careful attention of a scholar studying ancient texts. He had graduated from the Virginia Military Institute, where he had learned to appreciate the engineering elegance of American small arms. The M1917's 30-06 Springfield cartridge delivered 2,700 feet per second muzzle velocity with devastating effect at ranges up to 500 meters. Against Japanese infantry equipped with 65mm Arisaka rifles firing lighter cartridges at lower velocities, the Chinese would possess a significant ballistic advantage, provided they could close with an enemy that had dominated every battlefield from Manchuria to the Java Sea. The Japanese 18th Division, commanded by Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi, had earned its reputation as an invincible force through a series of stunning victories that read like pages from a military textbook on rapid conquest. The division had participated in the brutal subjugation of China, delivered the killing blow to British forces at Singapore, and spearheaded the lightning advance that drove Allied forces from Burma in 1942. Now, entrenched in the Hukong Valley with veteran troops who had never known defeat, the 18th Division waited for what they assumed would be another easy victory against Chinese forces they had been routing for 6 years. What the Japanese could not have anticipated was the transformation taking place in the training camps of India, where 23,000 Chinese soldiers who had retreated from the first Burma disaster were being rebuilt into a modern fighting force by American instructors. The men of the new 38th Division learned to field-strip their M1917 rifles in total darkness, load the 6-round magazine with lightning speed using 5-round stripper clips, and engage targets at ranges that would have seemed impossible with their old Chinese-manufactured weapons. They practiced jungle warfare tactics, coordinated artillery support, and close air support procedures that would allow them to bring the full weight of American industrial might to bear against an enemy that still relied on the tactical doctrines of the Russo-Japanese War. By October 1943, when the Chinese 38th Division began its advance from Lido toward the Japanese strongholds in the Hukong Valley, each soldier carried a weapon that represented the pinnacle of bolt-action rifle design. The M1917's dual-opposed locking lugs, spring-loaded blade ejector, and large non-rotating extractor had been copied from the German Mauser system and refined by British engineers into a weapon that could cycle faster than a Springfield, hit harder than a Lee Enfield, and function reliably in conditions that would jam lesser rifles. The 30-06 cartridge pushing a 150-grain Spitzer bullet at nearly 3 times the speed of sound gave Chinese marksmen the ability to reach out and touch Japanese machine gun nests, command posts, and observation towers with precision fire that their enemies had never experienced from Chinese forces. The first encounter came on a misty morning when Japanese patrols of the 55th Regiment, 18th Division, made contact with advance elements of the 112th Regiment near Xinguang. Sergeant Keisuke, a 10-year veteran who had fought from the Marco Polo Bridge to the gates of Batavia, led his squad through the dense undergrowth with the confidence of men who had never lost a firefight against Chinese troops. The Japanese carried Type 38 Arisaka rifles, robust weapons firing 65 by 50 mm cartridges that had served the Empire well in conventional warfare but lacked the stopping power and range of modern military rifles developed during the interwar period. The crack of the first M1917 rifle split the jungle silence like thunder, and watched in disbelief as the bullet shattered the thick bamboo stem behind which Private Tanaka had been taking cover. The 150-grain 30-06 projectile had punched through vegetation that would have stopped a 6.5 mm round, continuing its flight to strike the young soldier with devastating effect. As Chinese muzzle flashes erupted from concealed positions throughout the jungle, realized that these were not the demoralized troops his division had been pursuing across Burma 18 months earlier. These soldiers possessed weapons that could reach out and kill at ranges where Japanese return fire fell harmlessly short, and they were using those weapons with the precision of men who had been trained by the same instructors who had forged the most effective military force in human history. The battle for Yupong Jie became the first major test of the reformed Chinese forces and their American weapons against the Japanese division that had never known defeat. For 36 days, one battalion of the 112th Regiment found itself cut off and surrounded by Japanese forces that outnumbered them 5-1. Supplied only by airdrops that arrived sporadically through the monsoon clouds, the Chinese soldiers held their positions with M1917 rifles that cycled with mechanical precision even when caked with mud, blood, and the humid decay of jungle warfare. Each night, Japanese assault troops would probe the Chinese perimeter, only to be driven back by accurate rifle fire from positions they could not locate in the dense undergrowth. Staff Sergeant Chun Ming Dao of the 112th Regiment had carried his modified M1917 through every engagement since leaving the training camps in India. The rifle's Eddystone markings had been worn smooth by months of handling, but the weapon's function remained flawless despite conditions that would have rendered many rifles inoperable. When Japanese troops attempted to infiltrate Chinese positions under cover of darkness, Chun would lie motionless for hours, waiting for the distinctive sound of equipment scraping against vegetation that revealed enemy movement. The M1917's aperture sights allowed him to acquire targets quickly even in limited visibility, while the powerful 30-06 cartridge ensured that every hit would remove an enemy soldier from the battlefield permanently. The psychological impact on Japanese forces became evident as the battle dragged through November and into December 1943. Prisoners captured during failed night attacks told their interrogators that Chinese rifle fire had become so accurate and devastating that Japanese squad leaders were refusing to advance across open ground. Veterans who had charged British positions at Singapore and overrun Dutch defenders in Java now spoke of Chinese marksmen who could hit a man at 400 meters with the first shot, using rifles that fired cartridges powerful enough to penetrate the thick teak logs that formed Japanese defensive positions. For an army that had built its reputation on superior marksmanship and aggressive infantry tactics, the revelation that their enemies now possessed significant advantages in both range and stopping power created a crisis of confidence that filtered up through the command structure. Lieutenant General Shinichi Tanaka, who had assumed command of the 18th Division in late 1943, studied intelligence reports that described Chinese weapons with growing alarm. His staff officers, many of whom had served in China since the Marco Polo Bridge incident, insisted that Chinese forces had never demonstrated the capability to sustain accurate rifle fire at extended ranges or maintain disciplined fire control during prolonged engagements. Yet the evidence accumulating from the Hukong Valley painted a picture of enemy forces that could engage Japanese positions with precision fire from concealed locations, maintain their rate of fire throughout day-long battles, and continue fighting effectively even when surrounded and cut off from supply lines. The truth that Tanaka refused to acknowledge was that his division no longer faced the poorly equipped and inadequately trained Chinese forces that had been routed during the early years of the war in China. The soldiers advancing through the jungle toward his positions carried weapons that had been manufactured in American factories with production techniques that Japanese industry could not match, loaded with cartridges whose ballistic performance exceeded anything in the Japanese arsenal, and trained to fight with tactical doctrines that had been developed by military professionals who understood modern warfare in ways that the Imperial Japanese Army had never grasped. When General Sun Li-jen personally led the relief force that broke the siege of Yupong-ga on December 21, 1943, his soldiers advanced through the jungle with a precision that shocked Japanese observers. The Chinese moved in small groups, using their M1917 rifles to provide covering fire for advancing elements, while maintaining communication through signal procedures that had been drilled until they became instinctive. Each squad carried 60 rounds of 30-06 ammunition per rifle, far exceeding the ammunition loads that Japanese infantry typically carried into combat, allowing them to sustain high rates of accurate fire throughout extended engagements. The climactic moment came when Chinese forces of the 38th Division encountered the main defensive positions of the Japanese 55th and 56th Regiments in prepared positions that the enemy had been improving for months. The Japanese had constructed interlocking fields of fire, positioned their machine guns to sweep all likely approaches, and prepared fallback positions that would allow them to conduct a fighting withdrawal if their main line was penetrated. What they had not prepared for was an enemy armed with rifles whose range and accuracy allowed Chinese marksmen to engage Japanese positions from distances where return fire could not reach them effectively. The sound of massed M1917 rifle fire created a distinctive crack that Japanese veterans would remember for the rest of their lives. Unlike the lighter reports of 65mm Arisaka rifles or the harsh chatter of machine guns, the 30-06 cartridge produced a sharp, authoritative crack that seemed to echo through the jungle long after the bullet had found its mark. Chinese soldiers, firing from carefully prepared positions with excellent fields of fire, could engage Japanese machine gun nests, command bunkers, and communication trenches with single shots that either killed or wounded the occupants or forced them to abandon positions that had taken weeks to prepare. As word of the Chinese victories in the Hukong Valley reached Japanese Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, staff officers struggled to understand how forces that had been consistently defeated throughout the war in China had suddenly developed the capability to outfight one of the Army's most elite divisions. Intelligence reports describing Chinese weapons were forwarded to ordnance specialists, who confirmed that the rifles being used against Japanese forces were indeed superior to anything in the Imperial Army's inventory. The 30-06 Springfield cartridge delivered nearly twice the muzzle energy of the 65 by 50mm Arisaka round, while the M1917 sight system allowed for more accurate fire at longer ranges than Japanese infantry rifles could match. The strategic implications became clear when the Japanese 18th Division, which had been considered the cornerstone of Japanese defenses in northern Burma, began withdrawing from positions they had held since 1942. Chinese forces equipped with American weapons were not only holding their ground against veteran Japanese troops but actively advancing and forcing the enemy to retreat. For an empire that had built its military doctrine around the assumption of Japanese superiority in infantry combat, the reversal in Burma represented a fundamental challenge to the strategic assumptions that had guided Japanese planning since the start of the war. In the Philippines, where Japanese occupation forces had captured 27,412 American rifles during the surrender of American and Filipino forces in 1942, a different drama was unfolding that would demonstrate the M1917's effectiveness from an entirely different perspective. Japanese police units and garrison troops had inherited a substantial number of M1917 rifles along with the M1903 Springfield rifles and handful of M1 Garand rifles that had been abandoned during the American retreat to Bataan. For Japanese forces accustomed to the lighter weight and compact dimensions of their own weapons, the American rifles represented both an opportunity and a challenge. Colonel Nakamura Yoshio of the Japanese Kenpitai Military Police had been assigned the task of organizing captured American weapons for use by occupation forces throughout the Philippine archipelago. The M1917 rifles, with their robust construction and powerful cartridges, seemed ideal for equipping garrison troops and police units that needed weapons capable of stopping determined resistance fighters at extended ranges. However, Japanese soldiers found the rifles awkward to handle and difficult to maintain, particularly in the humid tropical climate that caused problems with any weapon not specifically designed for service in Southeast Asia. The irony became apparent when Filipino guerrilla forces, operating with the support of a few hundred American holdouts who had refused to surrender, began acquiring M1917 rifles from Japanese supply dumps, ambushed patrols, and sympathetic Filipino police officers who had been pressed into service by the occupation authorities. More than 200,000 Filipino guerrillas, operating in the mountainous regions and dense jungles where Japanese control remained tenuous, found that the captured American rifles gave them a significant advantage over their Japanese opponents in the type of long-range engagements that characterize guerrilla warfare. Master Sergeant Ramon Santos of the Luzon guerrilla forces had captured his M1917 rifle during a nighttime raid on a Japanese garrison in Nueva Ecija province. The weapon bore the Winchester markings that indicated it had been manufactured in New Haven, Connecticut, one of 465,980 rifles produced by Winchester during the Great War. Santos had learned to use the rifle's superior sight system to engage Japanese patrols at ranges where his enemies could not effectively return fire, picking off isolated soldiers and forcing the remainder to abandon their missions and return to the relative safety of fortified bases. The psychological warfare aspect of guerrilla operations using captured American rifles created problems for Japanese commanders that extended far beyond simple military casualties. Reports reached Manila describing Japanese patrols that refused to venture into areas where Filipino guerrillas were known to operate with American weapons, creating large zones where Japanese authority existed only during daylight hours and only when large forces were present. The accuracy and stopping power of .30-06 rifle fire had created a situation where individual Japanese soldiers could be killed instantly by enemies they could not see, striking from distances where Japanese weapons could not reach them effectively. In North Africa, a different encounter between American weapons and Axis forces was unfolding under the blazing desert sun, where German and Italian troops faced Allied forces, equipped with an eclectic mixture of rifles from 3 different wars and half a dozen different nations. American artillery crews and chemical mortar teams, many of whom had been issued M1917 rifles due to shortages of more modern weapons, found themselves in close contact with German armored reconnaissance units and Italian infantry as the battle lines shifted across hundreds of miles of desert terrain. Sergeant First Class Michael O'Brien of the 1st Chemical Mortar Battalion carried his M1917 rifle across the western desert with the same pride his father had carried a similar weapon through the Argonne Forest 25 years earlier. The rifle bore the Remington markings that indicated it had been manufactured at Ilion, New York, one of 545,541 rifles produced by Remington Arms during the desperate expansion of American armaments production in 1917 and 1918. O'Brien had learned that the M1917's robust construction and powerful cartridge made it ideal for the type of long-range defensive fire that mortar crews needed when enemy armored vehicles attempted to overrun their positions. The German Afrika Korps, under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize Allied artillery and mortar positions through rapid armored advances that would close the distance before support crews could evacuate their equipment. German tank commanders had learned to expect little resistance from artillery personnel armed with standard infantry rifles that lacked the range and stopping power to engage armored vehicles effectively. What they had not anticipated was encountering American weapons whose .30-06 cartridges could penetrate light armor plating and whose accurate fire could eliminate tank commanders, drivers, and gunners at distances where German machine guns could not return effective fire. The engagement at Kasserine Pass in February 1943 demonstrated the M1917's effectiveness in the hands of American support troops who found themselves fighting for their lives against veteran German armored units. When elements of the 10th Panzer Division overran American forward positions, mortar crews armed with M1917 rifles conducted a fighting withdrawal that inflicted casualties on German forces far exceeding what enemy commanders had anticipated from artillery personnel. The powerful .30-06 cartridges fired from carefully aimed rifles proved capable of penetrating the vision ports and driver compartments of German armored vehicles, while the rifle's accuracy allowed American soldiers to engage German infantry at ranges where enemy small arms fire could not reach them effectively. Oberstfreiter Hans Müller of the 7th Panzer Regiment had served in Poland, France, and the early campaigns in Russia before arriving in North Africa with absolute confidence in German tactical superiority over American forces. His first encounter with M1917 rifle fire came during a reconnaissance mission when his Panzer III received multiple hits from positions that seemed impossibly distant for infantry weapons. The .30-06 bullets struck his tank's armor with impacts that sounded like hammers hitting steel, creating spider web cracks in vision blocks and forcing his crew to button up their vehicle and retreat to safer positions. "The Americans have rifles that shoot like artillery," Mueller reported to his company commander, describing weapons whose muzzle velocity and ballistic performance exceeded anything that German infantry carried into combat. The 7.92 by 57 mm Mauser cartridge used in German service rifles delivered excellent performance, but the .30-06 Springfield round generated 300 feet per second higher muzzle velocity and substantially greater energy at all ranges, creating a ballistic advantage that became decisive in the type of long-range engagements that characterized desert warfare. German intelligence reports compiled during the North African campaign noted that American support troops armed with M1917 rifles demonstrated significantly greater combat effectiveness than Allied forces equipped with other small arms. The combination of superior ballistic performance, accurate sight systems, and robust mechanical construction allowed individual American soldiers to engage German positions with precision fire that disrupted operations and inflicted casualties at rates that seemed disproportionate to the number of weapons involved. In Italy, where Allied forces faced German defenders entrenched in mountain positions that seemed impregnable to frontal assault, the Free French Expeditionary Corps had been equipped with a mixture of weapons that included substantial numbers of M1917 rifles supplied through the Lend-Lease program. The French colonial troops, many of whom were experienced soldiers from Morocco and Algeria, found that the American rifles gave them capabilities that their enemies had not anticipated from forces that German intelligence had dismissed as poorly equipped colonial units. General Alphonse Juin, commanding the French Expeditionary Corps, had recognized that mountain warfare in Italy would require weapons capable of engaging enemy positions at extended ranges across terrain where advancing forces would be exposed to defensive fire from elevated positions. The M1917's ballistic performance and sight system made it ideal for the type of precision marksmanship that would be required to neutralize German machine gun nests, observation posts, and command bunkers positioned on ridgelines and mountain peaks that dominated the Italian landscape. The breakthrough at the Gustav Line in May 1944 demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of coordinated attacks by forces armed with superior individual weapons. When Moroccan gummiers of the French Expeditionary Corps advanced through the Urunsi Mountains that German commanders had considered impassable to modern infantry, they carried M1917 rifles that allowed them to engage German defenders from positions where return fire could not reach them effectively. The .30-06 cartridge's superior ballistic performance enabled French marksmen to neutralize German strong points at ranges approaching 600 meters, while the rifle's robust construction allowed them to function reliably despite the abuse of mountain warfare in conditions that ranged from Mediterranean heat to alpine cold. General Major Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydt, commanding German paratroop forces defending the Monte Battaglia area, reported to his superiors that Allied forces were demonstrating marksmanship capabilities that exceeded anything German forces had encountered during the Italian campaign. Individual Allied soldiers were engaging German positions with single-shot precision that eliminated specific targets rather than simply providing suppressive fire, using weapons whose ballistic performance allowed them to reach German positions that had been considered safe from small arms fire. "The enemy has rifles that can reach us anywhere," von der Heydt noted in his combat reports, describing weapons whose effective range exceeded that of standard German infantry rifles by several hundred meters. The combination of superior optics, higher muzzle velocity, and more powerful cartridges gave Allied forces armed with M1917 rifles a decisive advantage in the type of long-range precision fire that determined the outcome of mountain warfare where advancing forces had to cross exposed terrain under observation from elevated defensive positions. The technical superiority of American weapons became a subject of intense study by German ordnance specialists who examined captured M1917 rifles and attempted to understand how American industry had developed weapons whose performance exceeded German equivalents by substantial margins. The M1917's receiver, manufactured from nickel steel using production techniques that German industry could not replicate, proved capable of handling chamber pressures that would have destroyed rifles built to lesser standards. The weapon's sight system, with its protected aperture design and precise adjustments, allowed for more accurate fire than the open sights used on German service rifles, while the .30-06 cartridge's ballistic coefficient gave American bullets trajectories that remained supersonic and lethal at ranges where German bullets had lost their effectiveness. German weapons designers studying captured American rifles noted that the M1917 represented a level of manufacturing precision and material quality that German wartime production could not achieve. The weapon's interchangeable parts, precise tolerances, and consistent performance characteristics reflected an industrial capacity that allowed American manufacturers to produce over 2 million rifles in 18 months, while maintaining quality standards that exceeded those of rifles produced by German arms factories under peacetime conditions. As 1944 progressed and German forces found themselves facing American weapons in increasing numbers across multiple theaters, the cumulative effect of Allied small arms superiority began to influence tactical decisions at the highest levels. German commanders who had initially dismissed American military capabilities were forced to acknowledge that American industry had produced individual weapons whose performance characteristics gave Allied forces significant advantages in the type of precise, long-range engagements that determined the outcome of modern warfare. The M1917 rifle's combat record in the hands of Allied forces during World War II demonstrated that weapons designed and manufactured using American industrial techniques and engineering standards could provide decisive advantages even when used by forces that lacked the numerical superiority or tactical sophistication of their enemies. Chinese soldiers who had been consistently defeated by Japanese forces when armed with obsolete weapons suddenly became capable of outfighting elite enemy divisions when equipped with American rifles. French colonial troops who had been dismissed by German intelligence as poorly equipped second-line forces became capable of breaking through defensive positions that had been considered impregnable when they carried weapons whose ballistic performance exceeded anything their enemies possessed. The strategic implications extended far beyond individual battles or tactical engagements. By 1944, American industrial production had equipped Allied forces around the world with weapons that represented the highest level of small arms technology available to any military force in human history. The M1917 rifle, despite being a design that originated during World War I, incorporated engineering improvements and manufacturing techniques that gave it performance characteristics superior to weapons being produced by Axis nations using their most advanced industrial capabilities. In Burma, the final defeat of the Japanese 18th Division came when Chinese forces armed with M1917 rifles demonstrated that they could not only hold defensive positions against veteran Japanese troops, but could also conduct successful offensive operations that drove the enemy from positions they had held since 1942. The Battle for Wollobam, which concluded the Hukong Valley Campaign on March 9, 1944, saw Chinese forces advance across terrain that Japanese commanders had considered impossible to assault, using accurate rifle fire to neutralize enemy strong points and advance through defensive positions that had been designed to channel attacking forces into kill zones. The effectiveness of Chinese forces armed with American weapons forced Japanese commanders to fundamentally reconsider their strategic assumptions about the war in Southeast Asia. Intelligence reports reaching Tokyo described Chinese divisions that could outfight veteran Japanese units in direct combat, advance through terrain that Japanese forces had considered impassable, and maintain offensive operations despite supply difficulties that would have halted less well-equipped forces. The transformation of Chinese military capabilities represented a strategic threat that Japanese planning had never anticipated and for which existing military doctrine provided no adequate response. Staff officers at Japanese Imperial General Headquarters studying reports from Burma noted that American weapons had enabled Chinese forces to achieve tactical results that seemed impossible based on previous combat experience. Forces that had been routed consistently during the early years of the war in China were now advancing through Japanese defensive positions, inflicting casualties at rates that exceeded Japanese replacement capabilities, and demonstrating combat effectiveness that approached levels achieved by elite Japanese units during their most successful campaigns. The broader implications became clear when similar reports began arriving from other theaters where Allied forces armed with American weapons were demonstrating combat capabilities that exceeded what Axis intelligence had considered possible. In North Africa, American artillery crews were engaging German armored units with small arms fire that proved devastatingly effective at ranges where German return fire could not reach them. In Italy, French forces were breaking through German mountain defenses using individual weapons whose accuracy and stopping power allowed them to neutralize enemy strong points that had been considered immune to small arms attack. By late 1944, When German forces on the Western Front began encountering Free French troops equipped with M1917 rifles during the advance toward the Franco-German border, the pattern had become unmistakable. American weapons provided Allied forces with capabilities that Axis military doctrine had not anticipated and for which existing tactical procedures provided no adequate countermeasures. Individual soldiers armed with M1917 rifles could engage enemy positions with precision fire at ranges where return fire was ineffective, allowing Allied forces to achieve tactical results that seemed impossible based on numerical strength or positional advantages. The final vindication of American weapons design came during the desperate German attempts to halt Allied advances during the winter and spring campaigns of 1945. Free French forces advancing through the Vosges Mountains and across the Rhine River carried M1917 rifles that enabled them to engage German defensive positions with devastating effect. German commanders, many of whom were veterans of the Eastern Front who had faced Soviet forces armed with weapons that German industry had helped design and manufacture, reported that Allied forces armed with American weapons demonstrated capabilities that exceeded anything they had encountered during years of combat against numerically superior enemies. General Oberst Johannes Blaskowitz, commanding Army Group G during the final defensive battles in southwestern Germany, noted in his final combat reports that Allied forces demonstrated individual weapon superiority that made German defensive tactics ineffective. The enemy possesses rifles whose range and accuracy exceed our own weapons by substantial margins, Blaskowitz reported, describing engagements where Allied soldiers could eliminate German strong points with single shots fired from positions where German return fire could not reach them. The technical analysis conducted by German ordnance specialists revealed that American weapons represented a level of engineering sophistication and manufacturing capability that German wartime industry could not approach. The M1917's metallurgy, precision manufacturing, and quality control standards reflected industrial processes that required resources and technical expertise that were no longer available to German manufacturers operating under wartime conditions with degraded raw materials and inexperienced workers. Japanese weapons specialists conducting similar analyses of captured American rifles reached comparable conclusions about the superiority of American manufacturing techniques and engineering standards. The M1917's consistent performance characteristics, interchangeable parts, and resistance to environmental damage demonstrated that American industry could produce weapons to specifications that Japanese manufacturers could not achieve even under peacetime conditions with access to the highest quality materials and most skilled workers. The psychological impact on Axis forces extended beyond simple recognition of American weapons superiority. Veterans who had built their military careers around confidence in the superiority of their own equipment and training were forced to acknowledge that their enemies possessed individual weapons whose performance characteristics gave them decisive advantages in combat. For soldiers who had been taught that victory depended on superior fighting spirit and tactical skill, the discovery that material factors could determine the outcome of individual engagements created a crisis of confidence that affected unit morale and combat effectiveness. The strategic consequences became evident as Axis forces found themselves unable to compete effectively against Allied forces whose superior individual weapons allowed them to achieve tactical results that exceeded what numerical strength or positional advantages should have made possible. In Burma, Chinese forces that had been consistently defeated when armed with obsolete weapons suddenly became capable of outfighting elite Japanese divisions. In North Africa and Italy, Allied forces demonstrated combat capabilities that forced Axis commanders to abandon tactical doctrines that had proven successful against enemies equipped with inferior weapons. The M1917 rifle service during World War II represented more than simply the story of an individual weapon system. It demonstrated that American industrial capability could produce weapons whose technical superiority provided Allied forces with decisive advantages that determined the outcome of major military campaigns. The rifle that had begun as a British design modified for American production during World War I became a symbol of American industrial supremacy and engineering excellence that enabled Allied forces to achieve victory against enemies who possessed superior numbers, better positions, and greater combat experience. As the war concluded with Allied victory in both Europe and the Pacific, captured German and Japanese military documents revealed the extent to which Axis forces had been influenced by their encounters with superior American weapons. Intelligence reports, tactical studies, and combat assessments compiled by enemy military organizations consistently noted that American weapons had provided Allied forces with capabilities that Axis military doctrine had not anticipated and for which existing countermeasures had proven inadequate. The final assessment came from Japanese General Headquarters in the weeks following surrender, when staff officers compiled comprehensive reports on the factors that had contributed to Imperial defeat. Among the critical elements identified in these analyses was the superior individual weapon technology that had enabled Allied forces to achieve tactical results that seemed impossible based on traditional military calculations. The M1917 rifle, along with other American small arms, had given Allied soldiers capabilities that fundamentally altered the dynamics of infantry combat in ways that Japanese military planning had never considered. German post-war analyses reached similar conclusions about the impact of American weapons technology on the outcome of major military campaigns. Wehrmacht staff officers noted that encounters with Allied forces armed with American weapons had consistently produced tactical results that exceeded what German military doctrine considered possible, forcing German commanders to abandon successful tactical procedures and adopt defensive measures that proved inadequate against enemies whose individual weapons provided decisive advantages at critical moments. The transformation of Chinese military capabilities in Burma represented the most dramatic example of how American weapons could alter the strategic balance in a major theater of operations. Forces that had been routed consistently during the early years of the war in China became capable of defeating elite Japanese divisions when equipped with weapons that provided superior range, accuracy, and stopping power. The Chinese new 38th Division's victory over the Japanese 18th Division at Hukong Valley marked the first time since the Marco Polo Bridge incident that Chinese forces had achieved decisive tactical victory over veteran Japanese troops in conventional combat. The broader implications extended to every theater where Allied forces encountered Axis troops. In the Philippines, guerrilla forces armed with captured M1917 rifles created security problems that forced Japanese occupation authorities to abandon large areas of the archipelago to enemy control. In North Africa, American support troops demonstrated that individual soldiers armed with superior weapons could engage enemy armored units with devastating effect. In Italy, French colonial forces broke through German mountain defenses that had been considered impregnable by using precision rifle fire to neutralize enemy strong points at extended ranges. The final chapter in the M1917's World War II service came during the closing weeks of the European War, when Free French forces advancing into Germany carried American rifles that had served in 3 different wars across 4 different continents. These weapons, many of which bore proof marks indicating they had been reconditioned multiple times during their quarter-century service life, continued to function with the mechanical reliability and ballistic performance that had made them effective against German forces defending their homeland during the final desperate battles of the Third Reich. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, commanding the French First Army during the final advance across the Rhine River, noted that his troops had achieved tactical success against German forces that seemed impossible based on numerical comparisons or positional advantages. French soldiers armed with M1917 rifles could engage German defensive positions with precision fire that eliminated specific targets rather than simply providing suppressive fire, creating tactical opportunities that allowed Allied forces to advance through terrain that German commanders had considered impossible to assault. The technical superiority of American weapons became a factor in German tactical planning during the final months of the war, when Wehrmacht commanders were forced to acknowledge that Allied forces possessed individual weapons whose performance characteristics gave them decisive advantages in combat. German defensive positions that had been designed to withstand assault by forces equipped with standard European military rifles proved inadequate against enemies whose weapons could engage targets at ranges and with accuracy that German military doctrine had not anticipated. The ultimate vindication of American weapons design and manufacturing capability came with the complete defeat of Axis forces in both Europe and the Pacific. The M1917 rifle, which had begun World War II as an obsolete weapon relegated to training duties and reserve forces, had proven itself capable of providing Allied soldiers with decisive advantages against the most experienced and well-trained enemy forces in the world. From the jungles of Burma to the deserts of North Africa, from the mountains of Italy to the final battles in Germany, American weapons had demonstrated that superior technology and industrial capability could determine the outcome of military campaigns. The lesson that emerged from the M1917's World War II service was that weapons designed and manufactured using American engineering standards and industrial techniques provided combat capabilities that exceeded what traditional military analysis considered possible. Soldiers armed with these weapons could achieve tactical results that seemed disproportionate to their numbers, training, or positional advantages, demonstrating that American industrial supremacy had created military capabilities that fundamentally altered the balance of power in global warfare. The Japanese 18th Division's defeat in Burma marked the moment when American weapons technology proved that industrial capability could overcome military tradition, tactical experience, and numerical advantage. The Chinese soldiers who had been routed consistently during the early years of the war achieved decisive victory over elite Japanese forces when equipped with weapons that represented the highest level of small arms technology available in the world. The M1917 rifle had traveled from the factories of Pennsylvania and Connecticut to the jungles of Southeast Asia, where it delivered American industrial might with precision and devastating effect that stunned an empire and changed the course of history. In the final accounting, the M1917 Enfield rifle served as more than simply an individual weapon system. It became the instrument through which American industrial capability reached across oceans and continents to provide Allied forces with the tools they needed to achieve victory against enemies who had seemed invincible. The rifle that had been designed by British engineers, manufactured by American workers, and wielded by soldiers from China to France had proven that superior technology and industrial excellence could determine the outcome of the greatest conflict in human history, delivering American power with mechanical precision that left no doubt about the industrial supremacy that would define the post-war world.